whatever the opposite of a green thumb is, I have it. I often rejoice that my backyard is fenced, because were it not fenced, you and the neighbors would see the wilderness that exists back there. Whatever the opposite of a green thumb is, I have it. But winter after winter after winter, I can't seem to kill everything. When summer comes, inevitably, some new growth emerges from my wilderness. I think of my not green thumb as we come to the conclusion of our homily series today, More Than a Building. Today we turn to the theme of hope, more hope. We began 3 Sundays ago looking at the historic collapse of community in the United States of America. From the late 60s to the present, all forms of community way down. We saw what we're missing without it. And we may, as we come to the end, say, well, is a renewal of community even possible? Is a renewal of connection possible? Is it possible for a church parish to be more than a building? Is it possible for a city to be more than people living in the same location? And today the Lord offers us a word of hope. So let's dig into our first reading today and see that message that the Lord gives. In our first reading today, we see the historic collapse of a vineyard. The landowner, he chooses a fertile hillside. He spades it. He clears it of stone. There he places the choicest vines. He builds a watchtower, a wine press. He spares no effort, no resource, nothing lacking in the work of the landowner. Well, what happens? The vineyard, despite all his effort, yields bad fruit. It yields rotten fruit. So what does the landowner do? He allows the historic collapse of the vineyard. He takes away the hedge. He gives it to grazing. He breaks through the wall, tramples it, makes the vineyard a ruin, allows thorns and briars to overgrow it, brings about drought. The landowner builds up this vineyard, and then he allows its historical collapse. How is that a message of hope this morning? Well, what does the landowner not do? He does not uproot the plants. He doesn't destroy the vineyard. He doesn't obliterate the vineyard. He allows it to be ruined, to be trampled, overgrown, but the seeds, the roots, the plants, they are all still there. The vineyard can still come back to life. Hope is not lost. What does Isaiah tell us at the end of the first reading? The vineyard of the Lord is the house of Israel. The vineyard's a church parish. The vineyard's a city. The vineyard is a community. The vineyard is connection. God builds up a community, and then he allows its historic collapse so that we realize how disconnected we already are. And at the same time, he always gives us hope. The vineyard has collapsed, but it has not been destroyed. Now is the time to rebuild. That's the message of hope from our gospel. And so we go back to the question, is this rebuilding possible? Yes, it absolutely is. And if the Word of God hasn't convinced you, just look to history. Robert Putnam, in his book that we started with 3 Sundays ago, he draws our attention to the period from 1870 to 1915. Period historians call the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. They found themselves in a very similar situation as us. But that did not deter them what did they do? How did they respond? Well, most of the major community institutions that we know today, they came to birth during this time period. The Red Cross, the Knights of Columbus, the Rotary Club, the PTA, the Sierra Club. In less than a decade, from 1900 to 1910, most nationwide youth organizations that still dominate today were founded. The Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, the Boys and Girls Club, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, 4-H, all birthed during this era. We take for granted today kindergarten. Kindergarten was born during this time period. We take for granted city playgrounds, born during this time period. Museums, public parks. This birth of community in the midst of a historic collapse of community. God reminds us that it is possible, and we have seen it before. What do? It's possible. We've seen it in history. What do? Well, we need to examine our attitudes. All too often, we can give into cynicism. Woe is us. Woe is us. Bemoan the way that things are today, which only paralyzes us and keeps us from rebuilding the vineyard. We reject nostalgia, which imagines some idyllic time period of 50, 60, 70 years ago, and then somehow we've got to reincarnate that today, and that's our only hope. We've got to reject indifference, which says, doesn't really matter, I can live without it. That was not the attitude of those men and women from 1870 to 1915. No. Their attitude is an attitude of hope. The future will not take care of itself. We can't go back to 1850. We need to do community today. And we have to start here. If we become more than a building, our neighborhood can be more than a neighborhood. If we become more than a building, our schools can be more than schools. If we become more than a building, our cities can be more than cities. It requires hard work, but the Lord tells us it is possible. And we've seen over these last 4 Sundays that it is absolutely worth it. Every summer, my garden comes back to life with almost no effort on my part. Imagine what happens when we're intentional about community, when it becomes a priority for us, for our families, for our parish. We can and we will rebuild community and connection. All that's required is that we devote ourselves to it. Can we be more than